Good morning. I'm really gonna talk about two major things, and that's insecticide seed treatments and BT corn technologies. There's a few other things we could discuss, but I mean the reality is that's the biggest decisions we make. I tell people often that 95% of our insect control in corn is done at the time of planting, and that's either whether we're using an insecticide seed treatment or something in furrow, and then the selection of the BT corn technology. It's pretty dang rare, really, that you have to make additional insecticide applications, and even rarer that people do it. Or if they do it, they just throw it in with their fungicide or something. So 95, 98% of our insect control is done at the time of planting. I just got a couple shots here to start off with, really talking about, because my first topic will be insecticide seed treatments. And I'm not going to go in a huge amount of detail. On the left there, you see wireworm. It's one of our more consistent insect pests. One thing I want you to keep in mind is, as far as I know, all the seed corn that we buy has some kind of an insecticide seed treatment on it. Because of that, there's a lot of things I used to see early in my career that I don't see really at all anymore. For example, southern corn rootworm. The only time I see that is when I have untreated corn seeds. So I'll see it in sweet corn or in some of my trials. Wireworm is one that sometimes you'll see. They're not super susceptible to all the seed treatments, particularly at the lower rates. Another one we'll commonly see is sugarcane beetle. Well, it's a pretty uncommon pest, but when it happens, it's pretty apparent that some of the insecticide seed treatments aren't very good. That's the picture of the beetle in the bottom left. Picture of Lauderdale County a number of years ago, and we frequently see this insect when a field has a lot of Bermuda grass in it. In this case, it was a Bermuda grass pasture the year before, and the guy converted it, and that rings the dinner bell for this sugarcane beetle. They're very attracted to the Bermuda grass, and you can see the impact that the insect had on taking out plant stands. This field was a complete loss when it was all said and done. That can be rectified, but typically it has to be done at the time of planting, either with insecticide seed treatment selection or the use of an in-furrow treatment. So a lot of people don't recognize when they have an insecticide or an insect damaged plant. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, scouting, or at least recognizing the problem. And really, anytime you see damage to the growing point of a corn plant early season, often that's going to result in what we call dead heart. Dead heart is essentially that. It killed the heart of the growing point of that plant. That picture on the left that you're looking at is a picture from one of my test plots this year, and you can see how that center leaf that's coming out is starting to wilt. That's a sure sign that there's damage to the growing point of the plant. And on the right is another plant taken, a picture taken at the same time, that's a little farther along in the process, and that growing point is essentially died. Once that happens, that plant's doomed. Now, it may not actually die. Often they will if it's small like this, but if it doesn't die, it'll bush out later in the season. And that's one thing you can look for later in the season if you see plants that are all bushed out, not growing correctly. Now, if you pull up the plants, a lot of times I'd have a hand trowel with me, and I'll dig up that plant or the neighboring plant. 99 times out of 100, you're going to see something wrong underground with that plant. In this case, on the picture to the right, you actually see sugarcane beetle damage, which is very apparent. They feed very grossly. They do a lot of gouging. If they do less feeding, you may not see dead heart, but you may just see stunting or discoloration of the leaf tissue. The really important thing with most of these soil insect pests is you do not have an option to control them post-emergence. Most of them are below ground. There's no effective insecticide seed treatments. In the case of sugarcane beetle, sometimes you can reduce the damage, but very often it's too little, too late. Again, another thing I scout for, besides just the plants and dead heart, is I look for uneven stands, and I also look for uneven plant height. Typically, if you don't see dead heart, but you see some, I guess you'd call it sublethal effects, you start looking at the plants that are stunted or delayed in the field, and those plants have some kind of damage to the corn plant. So just an example of how impactful this can be, and I can show you a lot worse examples. You've seen pictures already of complete devastation, but this is a corn stand that we took this year, corn stand counts. We count the center 2 rows of 35-foot plots, so that's the number of plants per 70 row feet. And this is a regional trial we do, looking at all the various active ingredients that are commonly used as corn seed treatments. And the two things I really want to point out are the untreated in particular. The untreated doesn't have any insecticide seed treatment, and you can see substantial stand loss. This doesn't capture the total impact of the infestation, in this case was wireworm, because we have a lot of plants that have this sublethal effect. You also see that there's another treatment in there called lamivia that by itself does not provide a wireworm control. This is a pioneer option. They're selling something called Lumisure plus lamivia. Lamivia is a non-neonicotinoid. It's the exact same active ingredient that you see in a foliar insecticide called Prevathon or Besiege. It does have some values of seed treatment, but that value does not include wireworm control. You can see that where you added Lumisure to it, it performed well. Lumisure is clothianidin, so that would be the same thing as Poncho at the 250 rate. Real take home from this study this year, though, is I think that any kind of insecticide seed treatment that's commercially sold would probably have controlled this problem of wireworm, which was a moderate infestation, but even at moderate levels caused stand loss. So I guess one of the points I want to make is it's really challenging, unless you know what's in the field at the time of planting, to know whether or not you need higher insecticide seed treatment rates. One thing I would suggest, that if you have a history of sugarcane beetle infestation, or you've got a Bermuda grass, or you're taking a field out of Bermuda grass, that would be a time I would definitely lean towards higher insecticide seed treatment rates, specifically Poncho and specifically, or Lumisure, but Poncho 500 or 1250 is quite a bit better than Cruiser or Poncho at 250. If you have fields that were fallow the year before, pasture the year before, that's a no-brainer. Either using a higher insecticide seed treatment rate or supplement it with something sprayed in furrow or potentially a granular. I don't think we really know on cover crops what the impact is. I haven't seen any problems, but I haven't looked real close. I know some of my colleagues that have looked at cover crops have seen issues with stink bugs moving over from the cover crop and feeding on emerging seedlings. Some of the seed treatments have pretty decent activity on stink bugs, but not bulletproof by any stretch. I'm going to show a video here in a minute, but product and rates sometimes matter. Usually the standard seed treatment rates that come on the company seeds are good enough, but there are special circumstances where you might want to use higher rates. Really, our goal is to get uniform, even plant growth. I want to encourage everybody, we have some good resources online, and in fact, I can pull one up that talks specifically about below ground insect pest management. This is from our UT Crops Guides website. It talks about the various pests that are out there. It talks about sampling, and it has some photo gallery images, some of which you've already seen. There's a good example of sugarcane beetle damage right there, and you see stunning and whitening on the leaf margins, which is very characteristic. Also on that page, and what I really wanted to show you, is there's a table that shows you the various commercial insecticide seed treatments that are out there and how effective they are, a rating of their effectiveness against these various pest complexes. And you can scroll over and look and see whether it's really good on sugarcane beetle or not, other pests that are out there. As a rule of thumb, it's pretty obvious that these higher rates are more consistent. They're just not always necessary. In a normal circumstance, the 250 rates are just as good, but in certain circumstances, you do benefit from higher rates. It's a real challenge to figure out which circumstances those are, because it's hard to sample below ground insects. One thing I've seen is what you've had in the past matters. I mentioned Bermuda grass. I've mentioned fields that are fallow. That's important. I've had a couple of experiences the last few years with people that have had significant wireworm infestations to the point where it required replanting. In all of those cases, it was Cruiser 250, which is typically okay, but it won't hold up sometimes to the higher pressure. And what was interesting about those fields is they were following wheat beans. And so they had beans the year before, planted wheat, harvested the wheat, and the soybeans did not have an insecticide seed treatment on there. And of course, the wheat very often didn't. So with wireworm, which has a 2-year life cycle, actually the previous crop made a huge difference. You probably would have not have seen that problem if the previous soybean crop had an insecticide seed treatment, because you would have taken those wireworms out when they were smaller and more sensitive. You plant corn the next year, you didn't have an insecticide seed treatment. Now you're dealing with wireworms, their 2nd year of life, and they're much bigger and harder to kill. That test I showed you, the stand loss in myelin, was really interesting to me because it was a 6-rep test. And the first 4 reps had a lot more damage, a lot more wireworm damage than the last 2 reps. And I talked to Blake Brown at the experiment station there, and what had happened is we were following Vince Pantalone. He had beans there the year before looking at various varieties. Those varieties did not have an insecticide seed treatment. Dr. Pantalone's test was 4 replicates deep. The last 2 reps were filled with a soybean that had an insecticide seed treatment. So that previous insecticide seed treatment had an impact on what we saw the next year in corn. That's the kind of stuff that's really hard to wrap your mind around. Let me show just a video from that test. And I'll hope I won't turn my audio on. Let's see, I have one up here somewhere. So what you're looking at there is actually my border rows next to this test that did not have an insecticide seed treatment. And as you look through, what you see is there's a lot of gaps in that. Those gaps were caused by wireworms much earlier, and the plants have died. Now the next 4 rows are filler that has an insecticide seed treatment. And as I resume playing, what you're going to notice is it's much more of a picket fence, much better in stands of corn. And of course, that's what we want. So now I'm going to switch directions, and I'm going to talk about BT corn. And I know a lot of this stuff is kind of old news for y'all, but we do have some newer folks on here, and this is a pretty complicated topic. Of course, BT corn is transgenic corn, GMO corn, where they've taken the genes from a bacteria, specifically Bacillus thuringiensis, and they put it into the genome of the corn plant. And when it does, when they've taken certain genes out, it makes those genes express for BT toxins that are fairly specific to certain insects. The ones we're most interested in, the BT toxins we're most interested in Tennessee, are the ones that have impact or control caterpillar pests, specifically corn borers. Some also have activity on corn earworm and fall armyworm. When you get into the Midwest, they have some beetle pests, specifically the western and northern corn rootworm. That's one of their major target pests that we very rarely have down here. There are BT traits that are specific to those beetle pests. Actually, it's the beetle larvae that we don't really need down here. So when you start looking at these toxins, there's really 2 different groups of toxins. One's called crytoxins. There's a whole bunch of different crytoxins, and one's called VIP, or the Viptera toxin. So the crytoxins that we're most using in Tennessee are Cry1 or Cry2 toxins, and these have activity specifically on caterpillars. The range of activity, what they affect, varies depending on the toxin. For example, Cry1F is pretty good on things like fall armyworm and cutworm, but it's very poor on corn earworm. But all of these crytoxins that I have listed there, Cry1 and Cry2, are very good, exceptional at controlling the corn borers. The VIP toxin, specifically VIP3A, is being used in cotton and corn, is also very active on some caterpillar pests, and it's especially good on corn earworm and fall armyworm. So it's being introduced in a big way in a lot of the varieties right now because it has those activities. It's very showy because it controls corn earworm, and you don't see the tip feeding, and I'll show you that. The other cry proteins that might be in some of those varieties are Cry3, Cry34, Cry35, Those are the rootworm toxins that, again, have very limited utility in Tennessee, and I'll circle back to that. So what pests are being controlled, and I've already touched on this. The primary targets in Tennessee, and the two I really care about, are the European and Southwestern corn borer. We have both species in the South. In the Midwest, they have almost exclusively European corn borer. The Southwestern is more common in the South, and it's also a more damaging insect. It's bigger, and some of the behavior and the way it feeds causes more injury. In the Midwest, those other cryoproteins I mentioned are affecting Western and Northern corn rootworm. They do not affect Southern corn rootworm, which can be a pest of corn in the South. And then, of course, there's some secondary targets to those cryoproteins, which I've already mentioned, or the VIP proteins, including corn earworm, fall armyworm, and cutworm. I'm not very concerned about that, but there is some activity there that sometimes has a benefit. The level of the control of these pests, again, varies depending on the insect and what type of BT corn is being used. So if you go to our insect control guide or you go to our online resources, what you're going to see is a list of an example of BT corn traits and their relative efficacy on these various pests. You'll notice everything that I would recommend or that we would plant in Tennessee has excellent control of either European or Southwestern corn borer. You should not need any supplemental insect control. You just do not see damage. And in fact, in my experience, if you see damage of corn borer in a BT cornfield, you found a non-BT corn plant. They're just that good. If you want to know whether a technology has that VIP trait in there, you can look at this table, and if you see excellent under corn earworm or excellent under fall armyworm, that's correlates directly to the presence of that VIP toxin. I have Western corn rootworm in this table, very similar. If you see good or excellent there, that indicates it has some of those cryoproteins for Western corn rootworm. Again, we don't need Western corn rootworm control in Tennessee except in very specific circumstances. So what are those circumstances? Over the years, I've probably had a half dozen, 8 or 12 calls about significant infestations of Western corn rootworm in Tennessee. The Western corn rootworm, Southern corn rootworm are very closely related. On the left, you're looking at beetles that very often feed on the silks once they emerge in late June or July. But the damaging stage of the insect is really the larval stage on the right. And that's actually a picture of a Southern corn rootworm, but you can't tell them apart in the larval stage, or at least I can't tell them apart in the larval stage. But they do root feeding. They can cause dead heart, but even if they don't cause dead heart, they can greatly stunt the plant. We almost never see that in Tennessee. The exception is when we plant corn year after year after year after year after year. And it usually takes 7 or 8 or 10 years for this to really show up, where you build populations that are very obviously causing economic damage. So I've had a number of calls from the middle part of the state, a few calls from the eastern part of the state, where you have growers often in silage operations, where they have 1 or 2 fields where they're constantly growing corn or for their cattle. I saw this in West Tennessee a few years ago on the Pioneer Station, where they were growing non-BT corn isolines in the same place for 15 years. So I don't want to totally dismiss it, but this shouldn't enter into our thinking very often when we're choosing BT corn hybrids. So I'm just going to show a few pictures of Southwestern corn borer and European corn borer and some of the damage they do. And I have some really good videos from last year and this year. But again, the BT corn technologies are super effective. So this pest is only a problem in areas where we grow non-BT corn or where we're growing non-BT corn. And typically the only place we have significant infestations is with growers or areas that are growing non-BT corn for 2 or 3 consecutive years. They can bounce back pretty quickly. So we have some growers, one in the Medina area just essentially refuses to grow BT corn, and it shows. If you go to our federal wildlife refuges, they're not allowed at this time to grow BT corn. So they have some chronic problems with Southwestern corn borer. The other places we see them in the state are on the experiment stations. At Milan, they follow the refuge guidelines pretty religiously. So a good portion, at least 20% of their crop is non-BT corn, and that creates some Southwestern corn borer, and a similar situation in Jackson. This is a picture, of course, of the moth. It's a pretty nondescript white moth. These are the egg stages, and you can see they change over time. They're pretty difficult to find unless you get some training. Normally, we don't have a lot of people scouting corn, but if you're interested in scouting corn for southwestern corn borer, you need to learn how to identify the eggs. They're very often laid in clusters of 2 to 6 eggs, kind of like fish scales. When they're first laid, they're these white colored. As they get a little bit older and closer to hatching, you start to see this candy cane effect. This is just some pictures of the larvae. It's a pretty distinct larvae in that, particularly when it's larger, it's pretty white, it's a pretty larvae really, with conspicuous black spots on it. A little bit more challenging when it's smaller. It could be confused with other larvae, particularly when it's really small with corn earworm, because they may be found in the same place. There are some behavior things that help you figure out if you're dealing with a corn borer. First of all, if it's inside a corn stalk, boring in a stalk, that's a pretty good indication you've got some kind of corn borer. A lot of the corn borer larvae, when you mess with them, they can crawl backwards and forwards just as well. So if you touch it on its nose and it crawls backwards, just like it's going forward, that's a good sign you're dealing with a tunneling insect. It's very useful if you're a tunneling insect to be able to back up in a tunnel because you can't turn around. So this is some first generation leaf feeding in the whorl stage. Often you're going to see these kind of elongate lesions. This is when you unfurl the whorl, a little bit of raggedy stuff, but you'll see some frass. But that could also be caused by other insects such as fall armyworm or excuse me, corn earworm. One real telltale sign if you're in non-BT corn and you're looking on the outside looking in, and when you start seeing these lesions, kind of these window pane lesions emerging on these leaves emerging from the whorl. If you pull that whorl out and unroll it, you'll actually find the larvae very often, and that's what I've done on the left. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that the southwestern corn borer just isn't a tunneler. So this is a picture on the right of a larvae in its late instarge stage that's tunneled into the base of the plant. It's getting ready to pupate. That's where they pupate, is at the base of the plant. I don't think people recognize that in non-BT corn, they're also pretty significant ear feeder. And in fact, what probably makes them worse than corn earworm is they'll spend a lot of time feeding at the base of the ear. And they also spend a lot of time feeding in the shank. And you see a picture of one up here more towards the tip, and they've tunneled to that. But they actually get to these kernels that probably matter more. They're bigger kernels. This is obviously a site where diseases might enter, pathogens like fumonisin or aspergillus, which causes aflatoxin. And we see that very often. The tunneling essentially simulates nutrient and water stress, so it is well known to increase aflatoxin in the right environment. You will also, well, I'll talk about that later. So what's unique about the southwestern corn borer compared to the European corn borer is when it gets ready to overwinter, which is the second or third generations that occur in corn, it overwinters inside the stalk really at or below the ground level. And on the right, you're seeing an overwintering larvae. They tend to get cream colored, they lose their spots, but they're down there at the base of the plant. And with some experience, and I know a lot of you have this, you can walk through a field of non-BT corn and you'll start seeing girdled plants. And what I mean by girdle is before that larvae spends the winter, it comes up to that stalk and it essentially from the inside cuts, and I don't know if you can see my mouse move around there or not, but it cuts all the way around. Not always all the way around, but it's a pretty clean cut. It's not a break. And what it's doing is it's preparing its exit route for the following spring. It caps that with frass, and it's going to spend the winter down below. This is one of the real problems with the southwestern corn borer. If you have heavy infestations, those cut stalks will very often lodge and fall over in the field, and you lose a lot of yield because of combine efficiency. So that's one of the biggest issues. A European corn borer does not do that. It does most of its feeding higher in the plant. A lot of times you'll see the tops of the plants break over, but that doesn't have a real impact on harvest efficiency. One of the best ways for monitoring southwestern corn borer is to run these pheromone moth traps I got pictured here. they're very indicative of whether you have a problem. We run a trap line every year. I give people traps that want them. If somebody's consistently growing non-BT corn, they need to do this. And you can use these traps as a trigger for triggering insecticide applications or for scouting. And actually on this picture on the left, you can see there's a number of leaves here that have eggs on it. Now what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to kind of stop and go back to my videos again, and I'm going to show you some whirl feeding. And these have narration in themselves, but I'll keep them silent and just narrate it myself. Hopefully. So this is a picture from last year looking at whirl damage from southwestern corn borer during the early whirl stage. This is right here in the station. These aren't infested. This is a natural infestation that can very often occur if you're growing a lot of non-BT corn. And you can see in this paused image some of those lesions from these whirl feeding once these leaves have emerged from the whirl and grown out. Another thing I want to point out right there, I don't know if I got it. Let me back it up just a minute.
Scott, I'm not sure that your video is showing because all I can see is your slide.
Huh. Was that true on the previous video?
I think so.
Huh. Well, let me try something here. Maybe I need to go back to share screen. Thank you, Angela. Let me see if that. Well, maybe I won't be sharing those. Okay, I guess I'll have to forego that. I've done that before and had no issues at all, but c'est la vie. So hopefully you're back to seeing my screen, Angela, the slides, or maybe you always were.
Yes.
All right. So I won't show those videos, but what I was going to point out is, we had lots of plants with those elongate lesions, but we had a number of plants that had dead heart. So the southwestern corn borer can cause the same thing. If it gets in a plant small enough and tunnels down into the growing point, you'll get dead heart. I'm going to try to show those videos at the end again because I've got a number of them that I think would be worth seeing, but I don't want to interrupt this as we're going. So I mentioned the pheromone traps. This is an example from a number of years ago in Henry County of traps set around 2 different fields. And it's just a good example of why you need to trap, because we have pre-established treatment thresholds based on moth catches or also in number of infested plants, percent infested plants. So you see a trap location in the I never say that right, Purrier area, and one in the Mansfield area. And obviously we didn't have near as many moths in the Purrier, God, I can't say that word, in that area than we did in Mansfield. So the thresholds are kind of represented by those pink boxes. And I would suggest that during the whirl stage, you should always scout regardless of what those traps tell you. Those traps give you a lot of reinforcement. If you're running those traps during that mid to late May window and you never catch a southwestern corn borer, it's very unlikely you got a significant problem in the field. However, if you start catching 5 or 10 or 15, you should be concerned. If you start catching 40 or 50, it's very likely you're going to have a heavy infestation. So I would use those traps to trigger scouting, because scouting, once you learn how to do it, it's very easy. You're just walking through the field and looking for that whirl damage and pulling them out and determining whether you have southwestern corn borer larvae present, which you usually do. What happens when you get later in the season in the second generation, it gets a lot harder to scout. This corn's not fun to be in. The larvae aren't as predictable because they're not just going to be sitting in the whirl stage. And we have thresholds, a higher action threshold that says if you catch 100 moths the previous week, you should make an insecticide application. Now in a non-BT corn area, this is what you're going to see: a smaller first generation followed by a larger second generation. It's actually that first generation that can cause the most damage because it can really potentially kill that plant when it's small. but the second generation often really does more damage overall because it's infesting more plants on a wider area. And so, we would suggest spraying this in this circumstance, right around the end of June, providing the corn is in a susceptible stage. I didn't want to skip over completely European corn borer. I very rarely see issues with this insect anymore. And part of that is because we grow so much non-BT corn. It has a behavior pretty similar to the southwestern corn borer in that it's a stalk tunneler. I mentioned, though, that it spends most of its time at the ear or above. It'll tunnel the ear shanks. You'll find it in the ear as well. But then a lot of its tunneling is above. And what's kind of unique about it is it tends to tunnel in at the nodes. And very often you might see a tunnel and the frass accumulating on the leaf below that node. The larvae is a little bit different looking. It's kind of a pale brown, sometimes almost a pinkish hue to it. It doesn't get quite as big, but again, it's typically going to be in a stalk if it's not in the ear. When it's feeding in the whorl stage, it's actually pretty easy to kind of get the idea that you have European corn borer, because instead of having so many elongate lesions, you tend to see more rows of holes like you see here pictured on the right. But again, I would confirm that by essentially pulling out the whorls and looking for the larvae. So I want to talk about these BT traits and corn earworm. Again, I have some videos on this, but the corn earworm can do whorl feeding. We don't see that almost ever in BT corn because the BT corns do much better at controlling whorl feeding than they do in the ear typically. They can silk clip as well, but of course they're most famous for feeding in the ear on the ear tips. Angela talked about silk clipping before. We've actually done quite a bit of work with that. Sandy Steckel did her master's work looking at silk clipping, and the take-home point there was silk clipping didn't really cause much yield loss. We saw some of the same things, Dr. McClure, is that you'd see some skimpiness in the ears, but it didn't translate to yield. And actually what Sandy's study showed is a lot of the kernels in the ear compensate. Well, the kernels in the ears just got bigger. So they didn't look quite as good, but the other kernels got bigger, so we didn't see yield impact. There was an exception. We had a test site, actually it was in Missouri, where they had very poor pollination conditions. The corn did not pollinate well by itself, and when we caged, in that case, Japanese beetles on the ears, it made it even worse. We had much worse pollination. So it looks to me like silk clipping really has very minimal impact on yield, maybe no impact on yield, unless you're in those situations where you're under poor pollination conditions to begin with, high temperature and drought. You see some pictures of corn earworms in the ear tips. This is where they spend the most of their time. That's the good news, because a lot of that ear tip is not harvestable or not contributing very much to yield. And we've got pretty good data on that. It's very hard for me to document that we're seeing any kind of yield loss under any type of normal field circumstance to corn earworm, and it's hard to believe when you see that level of feeding. One thing we have seen is it does sometimes affect some of the mycotoxins, and in particular fumonisin. We'll see less fumonisin where we don't have as much corn earworm feeding. So I'll show some videos on that. This is just a take-home point. This is some tests we had in Milan last year in 2019. Of course, we don't have the data for 2020, but it almost always looks the same. We have a fair amount of southwestern corn borer, not a high level, I'd call it moderate southwestern corn borer infestations. And regardless of whether we have an early or late planting here, what you see is the hybrids that have BT corn in them significantly out yield those that don't have non-BT corn. And this is pretty common. I don't think people recognize how damaging this insect can be, even under moderate infestations of 10, 15, 30 bushel yield response can be observed. I've seen yield responses much higher than that under severe infestation. So keep in mind, it's an important insect in non-BT corn. Just a little refresher on resistance management and refuge requirements. If you plant BT corn, you are required to have a refuge of non-BT corn. Those requirements vary depending on where you're located in the state, but also what kind of corn you're growing, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The intent of this refuge is to provide susceptible insects that have not been selected for BT resistance to mate with any resistance resistant individuals that come out of the BT corn. And this resistance can happen. It's already been documented with corn earworm in some of our traits and with fall armyworm. So if you're in a cotton, it's tricky in Tennessee because we have differences between cotton growing areas and non-cotton growing areas. If you're in a cotton growing area, you're supposed to have no less than 20% non-BT corn refuge. And it's actually more than that if you're growing some of the older BT cotton technologies. Now, if you go to our control guide, the counties listed that are considered cotton counties are listed there as well as on this screen. I'm not going to read them. Most of you would know if you're in a cotton growing area, but there are a few counties on this list that don't grow a lot of cotton. So a lot of this is based on older acreage. Bayon's a good example on that list. Now it's a lot simpler in non-cotton growing areas. If you're not in one of those counties, you have reduced refuge requirements. And if you're growing some of the newer technologies, that refuge requirement can be as low as 5%. And that might include what we call RIB, which is refuge in a bag, which means they essentially mix the refuge with the seed corn and it's automatically out there. You don't have to worry about it. Again, the whole purpose of that is to have a refuge of non-BT corn, like you see pictured over here on the left, where you have insects that might be resistant coming out of there and mating with these all white moths, trying to dilute out the genes for resistance and remove them if they happen to fly back into a BT cornfield. It's a little more complicated than that, but the idea is to have a susceptible insects that will mate with the resistant insects. Those offspring are presumably still going to be susceptible, and we can take them out of the system if they go land on a BT corn plant. There's a lot of ways you can implement those refuges in a cotton growing area, but it has to be 20%. It can be a block, it can be strips in the field, it can be planted around the perimeter. It has to be within a certain distance, typically a half mile of the non-BT cornfield, or excuse me, the BT cornfield. So there's a lot of little nuances. You can see how this can get complicated real fast if you're growing older technologies and newer technologies. And if you happen to have the rootworm trait, there's different requirements. What I will tell you is the refuge requirements should be on the seed tag. They're supposed to be on the seed tag. We also have them listed in our control guide. So you can refer to that as well, or you can simply call and ask questions of me or the seed provider. Real take home for me is you got to be knowledgeable about what you're buying in regards to seed treatments and BT traits and refuge requirements. Dr. McClure will tell you that you can look at a bag of seed and it's not always very obvious what the BT trait is or the seed treatment is on there. So you really need to ask questions and research it. I have a hard time figuring it out sometimes myself. Again, reference the UT corn hybrid trials to select varieties, because we don't want to give up 15 bushels just to get a certain BT trait or something like that. We got to start with higher yielding varieties. Now, I didn't cover everything. There's some other topics I can discuss, but what I'm going to try to do, I hope, and Dr. McClure will let me know, I'm going to try to close that out and see if I can get these dang videos to work. I don't suppose you're seeing that now, are you?
Yes, it is. It's there.
Okay, well, good. Well, so this was the, let me rewind. This video here is going to be first generation Southwestern corn borer feeding. And this is very characteristic. This is actually just my test plots from last year, and it's the non-BT border rows, and virtually every plant's pretty heavily infested. And again, you see that window pane feeding that's there. As I progress through the video, I'll point out the dead heart in another one of these plants. Where is it at? There's one right there. See that growing leaf is dead hearted. And again, very characteristic symptoms of Southwestern corn borer feeding. We'll show that one. So this is later in the season. This is actually this season. So you'll notice that the bottom leaves have a lot of scarring. The newly emerged whorl leaves, or the leaves that came out later, are fine because they weren't fed on by the Southwestern corn borer. But again, some of those lesions that are very characteristic of Southwestern corn borer. It's later in the year, so these larvae have begun to tunnel. I'm presuming that's what I've got pictured here. Oh, this is this video. All right, so I've turned around and I looked at a plant. I'm focused on a plant that had dead heart earlier in the season. And now you see that it's just a bushed out, knotty mess. That's obviously not going to produce an ear. So that's where you really get into some pretty substantial yield loss. You know, a dead-hearted leaf just pulled out right there. So this is video taken at the same time. Again, the upper leaves look fine. They weren't fed on by the southwestern corn borer. This was a early world stage infestation. As you go down the plant, all of a sudden you start getting into that feeding sign again. Again, the very characteristic, those were kind of window pane lesions, but over time that tissue died and you just get the holes in there. What's characteristic about southwestern versus say a fall armyworm or a corn earworm is that's about the most damage you'll see on the leaf tissue. If you get a fall armyworm in there, they may cut off a whole leaf. It'll be big, ragged holes. So now you're starting to see some tunneling. I think I'll focus in on one here in a minute. There's a tunnel into the stalk. Didn't do a very good job of holding my camera there, but there's another tunnel. And then, of course, you see the tunnel right there at the base of the screen. And that's a pretty much fully mature larvae. It's the first generation. It's tunneled into that stalk, and it's going to pupate right there. And then the second generation is going to emerge from that point. And that generation is going to occur more or less around the year stage. And I may have one more video of that. I think I'll just skip on that. I did want to show 3 videos of the BT corn technologies and try to show you what we're getting with corn earworm control. The first one I'm going to show you is BT corn that doesn't have, or non-BT corn, so it doesn't have any trait. Let me see if I can find that video. So what I've done here is this is probably a month ago, I went back to my early planted corn trial. It was pretty heavily infested. I shucked back 5 years in a row. You can see a corn earworm right there. You can see the mess that it caused in the tip of the ear. I think all 5 of these plants I videoed had the same level of damage. If I ever move the camera, you'll see that. But a lot of frass, a lot of mess, mostly confined to the tip of the ear. Pretty much every plant has it. What's amazing to me is that I can't prove to you that causes any yield loss. And I've gone to great efforts. As a group, we've gone to great efforts. We've tried excluding them with insecticides, looking at trait comparisons. We see really no indication of yield loss. The exception may prove the rule, but that's the exception, it appears. Now I'm going to show you one that's from it is from a double pro corn. So it doesn't have that VIP trait in there. What we see with a lot of the common corn hybrids, I don't know why these things aren't easy to find, is they don't provide great corn earworm control, but they provide some control. So this is the exact same time I literally just turned around to the next row of the field, shucked back 5 ears, and this is a double pro technologies. It does not have that dip corn trait. You can see there's damage there, but it's not as extreme. Some of that will catch up because what we see with a lot of these BT corn technologies is the worms have developed resistance, but it still delays their development. So the damage occurs a little bit later. So, there's damaged ear right there. There's another damaged ear right there, but not near the extent of injury. And that's another thing we see is they tend to feed more up in the silk area. And I think that's because there's lower toxin levels there. But unfortunately, what this does is it selects for resistance. And we've seen that pretty consistently. What we've seen with a lot of the double pro and the triple pro corns is if you have very low corn earworm pressure, it actually works pretty well because you only get one larvae trying to get into that ear. If you have high corn earworm pressure, they don't hold up because for every susceptible one that gets in there, there's a resistant one that'll come in after it. And so there's one to take its place, and that's a sure way to select for resistance. Now, the last video I'm going to show you is the one that has 3 different BT traits, including that VIP trait, again, taken at the exact same time. And you'll notice all 5 of these ears essentially don't have any corn earworm feeding. Occasionally, you'll find a tiny larvae in them, but this VIP trait does a good job at reducing corn earworm feeding in the ear. Again, we've had a hard time showing that that's impacting yield, some benefit on reducing mycotoxins. I think with that, Dr. McClure, I didn't keep up very well with my time, but I'm sure I went long. I'll stop sharing my screen.
We're running a little long.